7 years ago, my fiancé walked out on me the night before our wedding and eloped with my sorority sister. Tonight at our university homecoming gala, he cornered me in front of the entire ballroom, laughed in my face, and told me that leaving me was the best financial decision he ever made. He had no idea that the multi-million-dollar acquisition he was celebrating tonight was entirely controlled by me. 5 minutes later, a legendary billionaire walked into the room holding my 4-year-old son. My former best friend literally dropped her glass. Let me tell you exactly how I destroyed their lives. The ballroom of the Grand Atlanta Plaza was dripping in black excellence for our 10-year university homecoming gala. Women wore custom silk gowns, and the men were sharp in tailored tuxedos. The room hummed with the energy of successful alumni networking, celebrating and showing off a decade of achievements. I stood quietly near the ice sculpture, simply enjoying the live jazz band when a tall shadow deliberately blocked my view. It was Julian, my ex-fiancé, the man who vanished 12 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Clinging tightly to his arm was Bianca, my former sorority sister, and the exact woman he left me for. Julian looked me up and down, with a sneer that twisted his handsome face into something ugly. He held a crumpled paper drink ticket from the cash bar between his fingers. Without a single word of greeting, he flicked his wrist and dropped the cheap paper ticket directly into my crystal wine glass. I watched the purple ink immediately bleed into the dark red liquid, ruining it completely. "Drink up, Tessa," he laughed loudly, making sure the surrounding guests could hear him. "I heard you are still bouncing around temp agencies trying to make ends meet. Take the free ticket. You look like you desperately need it tonight." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply stared at the soggy piece of paper floating in my glass. My dress was a custom-tailored, unbranded piece of Italian silk, but to Julian and his obsession with flashy designer logos, my lack of visible labels meant I was broke. Bianca stepped forward, flashing a rehearsed, pageant smile. She placed her left hand prominently on Julian's chest, making absolutely certain the ballroom light caught her massive 5-carat diamond ring. "Oh, leave her alone, Julian," Bianca purred, though her eyes were filled with pure malice. "She is just doing the best she can. Not everyone is built for luxury. You know, Tessa, I really have to thank you. If you had not been so utterly uninspiring back then, I never would have realized Julian needed saving. I saved him from a life of absolute mediocrity. Look at us now." Her words were designed to cut me down to the bone. 7 years ago, she had stood beside me in bridal fittings, pretending to be my rock, while secretly planning to steal my future. When Julian never showed up to the rehearsal dinner, it was Bianca who rubbed my back and told me to be strong. 2 days later, they posted their elopement photos from a beach in Cabo. My family had forced me to swallow my pride and keep quiet to protect our reputation in the church. They told me a good Christian woman suffers in silence. "Leaving you was the absolute best decision I ever made," Julian added, leaning in close. His breath smelled of expensive bourbon and cheap arrogance. "I am closing an $80 million acquisition tonight for my private equity firm. I am the king of this city, and you are just a ghost from a past I outgrew." People around us were staring now. The whispers started rippling through the crowd of successful alumni. They expected me to run to the restroom in tears, just like the old Tessa would have done. They expected me to shrink under the heavy weight of their projected success and my supposed failure. Instead, I calmly raised my hand and signaled a passing waiter. "Excuse me," I said, my voice completely steady and carrying perfectly over the smooth jazz music. My glass of 1990 Chateau Margaux was just contaminated with actual garbage. "Please have the sommelier bring me another glass and put it directly on my private tab." The waiter looked at the cheap paper ticket floating in the wine, then at Julian, and nodded respectfully. "Right away, Miss Tessa." Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes in exaggerated disbelief. "Still playing pretend I see. You cannot afford a $400 glass of wine on a receptionist's salary, Tessa. Do not humiliate yourself further in front of these people." I met his arrogant gaze head-on. "I am not a receptionist, Julian, and you should really learn to verify exactly who you are dealing with before you start bragging about a business acquisition that is not even signed yet." Bianca let out a sharp, obnoxious laugh that grated against my ears. Oh, please. Are you going to tell us you are some undercover boss now? You always had an overactive imagination. That is exactly why you could never face reality, and why Julian had to find a real woman to build his empire with. Andre stood there in his ill-fitting designer suit, smelling of cheap cologne and desperate ambition. His wife Chelsea hovered right behind him, clutching her sequined evening bag like it was a shield. Before I could even process Andre stepping into my personal space, right in the middle of a formal gala, Chelsea leaned forward with that sickeningly sweet smile she reserved just for me. "Oh, Tessa, your natural hair is just so brave for a formal black tie event," Chelsea said, reaching out her pale hand as if to touch my carefully styled curls. I stepped back just enough to make her hand drop awkwardly into the empty air. "I know how hard it must be for you to afford salon treatments these days, but confidence is key, right?" I stared at her, completely unbothered by the thinly veiled insult. My hair was styled by one of the top editorial professionals in the country, but I was not going to explain that to a woman who thought wearing a bright pink sundress to an evening gala was high fashion. Andre waved his hand dismissively, ignoring his wife and her rude behavior. "Listen to me, Tessa. I do not have time for this sibling rivalry nonsense right now," he said. "I have a massive crypto deal closing on Monday. It is guaranteed to triple our family investment, but the bank is giving me a hard time about liquid cash flow. I need you to co-sign a $50,000 bridge loan for me tonight. I have the digital paperwork right here on my phone." Andre stepped even closer, invading my space. His breath smelled of panic and stale mints. "Do you know what Mom and Dad will do if you ruin this for me?" he whispered harshly, his voice dropping beneath the jazz music so only our circle could hear. "They promised the church elders that my new platform would double the retirement fund. If I do not get this 50 grand tonight, the whole thing goes under. You are the only one with clean credit left in this family. You have to do this." I looked at my older brother, the so-called golden boy of our family. For years, my parents had paraded him around the community as a brilliant tech entrepreneur. The reality was that Andre jumped from one multi-level marketing scam to another, draining my parents' savings account each time while they smiled and called it venture capital. "You want me to co-sign a $50,000 loan for you?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Andre, you do not even have $50 to your name. You are currently driving a leased car that is 3 months behind on payments." Julian, who was still standing nearby with Bianca, let out a low whistle, clearly enjoying the family drama unfolding in front of him. Andre flushed a deep, angry red. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing around nervously to see if anyone had heard me expose his financial reality. "You owe this family, Tessa. Do not act like you are on some moral high ground. Mom and Dad dropped $80,000 on your lavish wedding 7 years ago. The same wedding that you managed to completely ruin when you could not even keep your own fiancé from walking out the door." Bianca let out a soft giggle, leaning into Julian's shoulder. "You wasted their money," Andre continued, pointing a finger at my chest. "They took out a second mortgage to pay for that disaster just to make you happy. You owe me this signature. It is time you paid your debts to this family instead of acting like you are too good for us." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost breathtaking. My parents had indeed taken out a loan for that wedding, but not for my sake. They did it to show off to their congregation, to prove they were the elite pillars of the community. And when Julian left me for my best friend, they did not comfort me. They blamed me for embarrassing them and demanded I stay quiet so Julian's private equity firm would still invest in Andre's failing app startup. They sold my dignity for a failed tech company, and now he wanted me to buy him another round. "I am not signing anything, Andre," I said, my tone sharp and final. "Your crypto business is a Ponzi scheme. You are using fresh investments to pay off your old debts, and when it collapses, you will be facing federal fraud charges. I will not let you attach my name to your criminal activities. Now step aside and enjoy the gala." Chelsea gasped, pressing her hand to her chest dramatically. Her eyes widened, and almost on cue, they filled with immediate shimmering tears. "How can you speak to your brother like that?" she cried, her voice rising in pitch and volume, specifically engineered to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. We are just trying to build generational wealth for our children, and you are attacking us. I did not raise my voice. Chelsea, stop performing. No one is attacking you. But Chelsea was already shifting into high gear, weaponizing her fragility. She took a sudden step backward, stumbling slightly on her heels even though I had not moved an inch toward her. Stop threatening me, Tessa, she wailed, tears now spilling over her cheeks and ruining her mascara. You are always so aggressive. Why are you being so hostile to me? I'm just trying to be a part of this family and you always act like you want to hurt me. The word aggressive hung in the air, heavy and loaded. It was a classic move. The moment a confident black woman sets a boundary, the immediate response from someone like Chelsea is to play the terrified victim. Chelsea's sobbing grew louder, echoing against the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. People at the nearby VIP tables actually stood up from their velvet chairs to get a better look. She let out a pathetic little whimper and clutched her pearl necklace. Please, Tessa. I know you are bitter that your life did not turn out the way you wanted, but you do not have to take your anger out on me. I feel physically unsafe right now. Conversations around us halted completely. The smooth jazz band playing in the background suddenly seemed far too quiet. Dozens of eyes turned toward our circle, watching the spectacle of a weeping white woman shrinking away from a calm, composed black woman. Julian and Bianca watched with absolute delight, practically vibrating with the joy of seeing me publicly humiliated. Somebody help me, Chelsea sobbed, burying her face in Andre's chest. She is scaring me, Andre. She is so unstable. Andre wrapped his arms around his wife, glaring at me with manufactured rage. Are you crazy, Tessa? Look what you did to her. You have always been jealous of Chelsea, and now you are verbally attacking her in public. You are a complete embarrassment. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a wave of harsh whispers judging my supposed aggression. The sea of tailored suits and silk gowns suddenly parted like the Red Sea. Marching straight down the middle of the makeshift aisle were my parents. My mother, Patricia, led the charge. As the highly visible and incredibly image-obsessed First Lady of our local megachurch, she was dressed in a conservative but blindingly expensive emerald green gown. She practically shoved a wealthy donor out of her way to get to me. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, absolute fury, the kind of anger she usually hid behind stained glass windows and choir hymns. Right behind her was my father, Pastor Calvin, adjusting his clerical collar. His jaw set tight, his eyes blazing with the righteous wrath he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons. They had seen Chelsea crying. They had heard the whispers of the elite alumni crowd. And true to form, they had already decided who was to blame before even asking a single question. They marched through the parted crowd like executioners, heading for the block, ready to sacrifice their only daughter to save their golden boy and their precious reputation. Before I could even take a breath to defend myself, my mother lunged forward and grabbed my bare arm. Her manicured acrylic nails dug so deeply into my skin that I immediately felt a sharp, burning sting. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume suffocating me as she spoke through a tight, vicious smile meant to look like a loving whisper to anyone watching from a distance. Stop embarrassing this family in front of our major congregation members. Patricia hissed, her grip tightening like a vice. People are staring at us, Tessa. Have you completely lost your mind making your sister-in-law cry in the middle of a crowded ballroom? You are acting like a wild animal. I tried to gently pull my arm away, but her nails only sank deeper, leaving crescent-shaped indentations in my flesh. I was not doing anything, I replied, keeping my voice low and completely steady. Andre demanded I co-sign a $50,000 loan for a business that is obviously failing. When I refused, Chelsea decided to put on a theatrical performance for the entire room. That is a lie! Chelsea sobbed loudly, peeking out from behind my brother's shoulder. Her tears were magically disappearing, but she kept her voice trembling perfectly. I just asked her how she was doing and she started attacking Andre's business. She is just so angry and bitter at us for being happy. My father stepped forward, completely blocking my path to the exit. Pastor Calvin was a man who used his towering height and deep booming voice to intimidate his flock into absolute submission, and he used that exact same tactic on his children. He pointed a thick, heavy finger right at my face, his eyes dark with judgment. "You will not speak about your brother's business ventures with such disrespect," my father commanded, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a Sunday sermon. "Andre is doing the Lord's work, trying to build a foundation for this family. As a woman of faith, you should be eager to help your own flesh and blood. You are single, and you have no family of your own to provide for. It is your duty to submit to your brother's needs and sign whatever financial documents he requires to keep his company afloat." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. "You want me to take on $50,000 of crippling debt just so Andre can continue playing pretend entrepreneur?" I asked, the sheer disbelief bubbling up in my chest. "You want me to ruin my financial future because he cannot manage his own life?" "It is not ruining your future," Patricia snapped, finally releasing my arm and crossing her arms over her chest. "It is called family loyalty, something you clearly know nothing about. You have always been so selfish, Tessa, always thinking only about yourself. It is exactly why you could not keep a good man like Julian." Speaking of Julian, he and Bianca had not moved an inch. They were standing right there, soaking in every single second of my degradation. Bianca was practically glowing with satisfaction, sipping her champagne, while watching my own parents tear me apart in public. Julian wore a smug, victorious smirk, clearly thrilled that the family he had abandoned was still bending over backward to punish me for his sins. "Well, we certainly do not want to intrude on a private family matter," Julian said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "We should probably head to our seats." Bianca and I are seated at the premium VIP table near the stage. My mother immediately spun around to face him, her angry expression vanishing instantly, replaced by a glowing, affectionate smile. "Oh, Julian, nonsense, you are not intruding at all," she cooed, reaching out to pat his arm. "You and Bianca are practically family. In fact, I am so glad you found your table. I made sure they gave you the absolute best seats in the house." I froze, processing her words. The premium VIP tables at this gala were incredibly exclusive, costing $10,000 a seat. Families usually reserved them to celebrate together. I had assumed my parents had purchased a table for us to sit as a unit. "You bought their tickets?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You invited the man who humiliated me and the woman who betrayed me to sit at our family table." Patricia turned back to me, her eyes cold and unapologetic. "Actually, Tessa, there is no room for you at our table tonight. Since you decided to act so selfishly and refused to help your brother, we gave your seat to Julian and Bianca. They are successful and respectable people who actually understand how to honor a family's reputation. You can go find a seat in the general admission section in the back if you even decide to stay." The absolute cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My own parents had not only invited the people who destroyed my life 7 years ago, they had literally given them my seat at the table. They were publicly replacing me, rewarding the man who left me at the altar, and punishing me for refusing to be financially extorted by my brother. Bianca let out a soft, triumphant laugh, resting her head on Julian's shoulder. "Thank you so much, Patricia," she beamed. "We are just so honored to be included with such wonderful people. It is a shame Tessa cannot join us, but I suppose she is more comfortable hiding in the back anyway. She was always so socially awkward." My father nodded in agreement, not even bothering to defend his own daughter. "Julian is a man of vision," he declared, placing a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. "We surround ourselves with winners, Tessa. People who are moving forward, not people who are stuck in the past, holding grudges." Before I could respond, the loud chime of a crystal glass being tapped echoed through the ballroom. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the main podium at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, alumni and distinguished guests," the MC announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "It is my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, a man who exemplifies the excellence of our institution. The Managing Director of Sterling Private Equity. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Julian Sterling." The ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause. Julian straightened his custom tuxedo jacket and flashed $1 million smile at the crowd. He turned back to look at me, his eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated arrogance. He leaned in close, his voice a low, mocking whisper, meant only for me to hear. "You see that, Tessa," he taunted. "That is what real power looks like. You can go sit in the back with the rest of the nobodies and watch. Watch and learn how real money is made." He turned and walked toward the brightly lit stage, leaving me standing alone in the shadows, while my family trailed behind him like loyal subjects following their king. They had no idea that the empire Julian was about to brag about was currently resting entirely in the palm of my hand. Julian adjusted his lapels as he stood behind the heavy oak podium, soaking in the thunderous applause of the ballroom. He looked every bit the master of the universe he believed himself to be. The spotlight caught the gold of his expensive watch as he raised his hands, calling for quiet. Down in the front row at the $10,000 table that should have belonged to my family, my mother Patricia was clapping so hard her diamond bracelets rattled. Bianca was wiping a single performative tear from her cheek, playing the role of the proud, supportive wife to absolute perfection. I stood near the back of the room near the kitchen doors, where my parents had banished me, watching the entire spectacle unfold. The contrast was almost poetic. They were sitting in the premium seats, worshipping a man who had publicly disgraced their daughter, while I stood in the shadows holding the power to erase his entire existence with one phone call. Julian leaned into the microphone, letting his deep, charismatic voice wash over the crowd. He spoke about vision and sacrifice. He threw around buzzwords like generational wealth and black excellence, drawing loud murmurs of agreement from the audience. He painted a picture of himself as a self-made titan who had overcome massive obstacles to build his private equity firm from the ground up. I knew the truth, of course. I knew about the massive loan his father had given him and the clients he had poached through underhanded tactics, but the crowd ate up every single word. Then Julian paused for dramatic effect. He gripped the edges of the podium and let his gaze sweep across the room. "Tonight is not just about celebrating the past 10 years," Julian announced, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Tonight is about securing the future. I am incredibly proud to announce that as of midnight tonight, my firm is officially being acquired by Apex Holdings." The ballroom erupted into cheers. Apex Holdings was a legendary name in the financial sector, known for its ruthless efficiency and massive capital. Julian waited for the applause to die down before continuing. "The deal is worth $100 million, he said casually, dropping the number like it was loose change. People gasped. Men in custom suits stood up to give him a standing ovation. My brother Andre was cheering so loudly his voice cracked clearly, hoping some of that money would trickle down to save his failing crypto scam. Julian held up his hand again, calming the room. "But success requires surrounding yourself with the right people." He continued, his tone shifting from triumphant to something darker and more condescending. "It requires cutting loose the dead weight." Julian looked directly over the heads of the wealthy alumni and locked his eyes straight on me standing in the back. The spotlight did not reach me, but he knew exactly where I was. He leaned closer to the microphone. "We all know people who refuse to grow," he said, his voice dripping with fake pity. "People who wallow in their own bitterness and let their potential rot because they are too stubborn to accept their own flaws. They stand in the shadows watching others build empires while they complain about how unfair life is. Do not let those people anchor you to the bottom. Sometimes the greatest business decision you will ever make is walking away from someone who is destined for mediocrity." The room murmured in agreement, completely unaware that they were agreeing with a man who had abandoned his fiancée 12 hours before their wedding. Bianca turned around in her seat to look at me, a smug, victorious grin plastered across her face. My mother actually nodded in agreement with Julian, completely validating his public insult of her own flesh and blood. I felt a presence beside me. Chelsea had slipped away from the VIP table and made her way to the back of the room just to rub salt in the wound. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, staring up at Julian on the stage. "You could have had all of that if you were not so difficult." "Tessa," Chelsea whispered, keeping her voice low, so only I could hear. She took a sip of her champagne, not even looking at me. "Julian is about to be a centimillionaire." He could have elevated this entire family, but you drove him away with your endless demands and your aggressive attitude. Now Bianca gets to live the life you threw away. You really should have just kept your mouth shut and learned how to compromise. I turned my head to look at my white sister-in-law. Her eyes were bright with malice, completely dropping the fragile victim act she had used just moments ago. She wanted me to break. She wanted me to cry and run out of the gala so she could return to my family and tell them how unstable I was. For a long moment, I did nothing. I just breathed in the cool, air-conditioned air of the ballroom. For 7 years, I had been the scapegoat. For 7 years, I had let my parents prioritize their community image over my emotional survival. I had let my brother treat me like an ATM. I had let Julian and Bianca control the narrative of our breakup, portraying me as the bitter ex while they played the star-crossed lovers. I had stayed silent because I thought keeping the peace was the right thing to do. I thought that if I just focused on my work and stayed out of their way, the pain would eventually stop. But looking at Julian basking in the applause for a deal I was quietly orchestrating, and looking at Chelsea smiling at my humiliation, I realized something fundamental. Silence does not protect you from abusers. It only gives them a quiet room to continue the abuse. I reached out and gently took the champagne glass from Chelsea's hand. I set it down on a passing waiter's tray. "Excuse me, Chelsea," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I have a question for the keynote speaker." I stepped away from the kitchen doors and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The heavy silk of my dress brushed silently against the carpet. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. People began to notice me. The whispers shifted as they saw me moving toward the front of the room. My mother saw me coming, and her face went completely pale. She started to stand up, her mouth opening to hiss another command, but I did not even look at her. Julian was still wrapping up his speech, talking about integrity and vision. To the side of the stage, there was an open microphone set up on a stand meant for the question and answer segment after his presentation. I walked straight past the $10,000 VIP table, ignoring Bianca's sudden glare of panic and my father's warning gesture. I stepped up to the microphone stand right in the middle of the ballroom floor. I reached out and flicked the metal mesh of the microphone with my index finger. The sharp sound of my finger tapping the microphone echoed through the grand ballroom and instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. Julian stood frozen at the heavy oak podium, his arrogant smile completely dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. He squinted against the bright stage lights, trying to figure out why the woman he just publicly humiliated was standing at the center aisle microphone. I leaned forward and adjusted the heavy metal stand so it perfectly matched my height. I did not rush the movement. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing the tension to fill every corner of the massive room. The jazz band had completely stopped playing. Hundreds of successful alumni and wealthy investors turned their heads to look at me. "That is quite the impressive acquisition, Julian," I said, my voice carrying smoothly across the ballroom, completely devoid of the bitter sadness he expected to hear. $100 million from Apex Holdings is certainly a milestone worth celebrating tonight. But I do have one quick question regarding the final due diligence process before the ink dries. Julian gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white under the spotlight. His eyes darted toward the master of ceremonies, looking for someone to cut my audio feed, but the sound engineer was too stunned by the unfolding drama to intervene. "Are you absolutely certain Apex Holdings will clear the transfer of those funds?" I asked, projecting my voice so every single elite investor in the room could hear every syllable clearly. Because I heard Apex has a very strict morality clause in their acquisition contracts, especially when it comes to managing directors who have been secretly embezzling money from their own client accounts for the past 3 years. The collective gasp from the ballroom was so loud it sounded like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the space. Up on the brightly lit stage, Julian actually stumbled backward away from his microphone. The bright spotlight illuminated every single drop of sweat that suddenly broke out across his forehead. All the healthy color drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost facing his own executioner. He opened his mouth to speak to deny the allegations, to laugh it off as a crazy joke, but absolutely no sound came out. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly made in front of his peers. The wealthy alumni at the front tables began whispering frantically among themselves. The ambient noise in the room shifted from shock to absolute panic. Several older men who had just been giving him a standing ovation were now reaching into their tailored tuxedo pockets for their phones. They were undoubtedly messaging their financial advisors to pull their money from his private equity firm before the morning bell. Before Julian could figure out how to defend himself, a blur of pink silk darted past my peripheral vision. Bianca had completely abandoned her $10,000 VIP seat and rushed toward the stage steps. She snatched the spare microphone right out of the master of ceremonies' hands, her eyes wide and wild with desperate panic. The microphone let out a sharp squeal of feedback, but she did not care. "Do not listen to a single word she says!" Bianca screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing horribly off the high-vaulted ceilings. "She is lying to all of you. She is just a jealous, bitter ex-fiancé who cannot get over the fact that Julian chose me instead of her. She has been obsessed with ruining our lives for 7 years." Bianca was breathing heavily, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me, while desperately trying to shield Julian from the judging crowd. "She is poor and pathetic, and she is just trying to ruin the most important night of our lives because she has absolutely nothing going for herself. Somebody get security and throw her out of this gala right now." The crowd, easily swayed by Bianca's dramatic victim routine, instantly turned their collective anger on me. The whispers shifted from financial panic to harsh judgment. A low chorus of boos began to ripple through the back of the room, growing louder by the second. People were shaking their heads, looking at me with absolute disgust. They saw exactly what Bianca wanted them to see: a crazy, jealous black woman trying to ruin a successful man out of pure spite. My mother did not wait for the building security team to arrive. Patricia practically materialized out of thin air, grabbing my right arm with both hands. This time, she did not care who saw her physical aggression. She dug her sharp acrylic nails into my bare skin so hard I felt the top layer tear and sting with sudden warmth. "You are leaving this room right now," Patricia hissed, her face red and distorted with uncontrollable rage. "You have completely disgraced this family, Tessa. I will not let you stand here and ruin your brother's business connections and your own family reputation just because you are a miserable, lonely woman. You are going to walk out those doors with me right this second, or I swear to God you will never be welcome in my home or my church ever again." She yanked my arm with all her strength, trying to physically drag me away from the center aisle microphone stand. I let her pull me for exactly 2 steps before I locked my knees and braced my weight against the carpet. With one swift, forceful motion, I jerked my arm completely out of her desperate grip. Patricia stumbled backward, gasping in shock as if I had struck her across the face. She looked at her empty hands and then up at my face, her eyes wide with disbelief that her designated scapegoat daughter had finally fought back physically. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to explain myself to a woman who would sell my soul to keep up appearances. I just looked at her with pure, cold detachment before turning my back on her, the booing crowd, and my sweating ex-fiancé on the stage. I walked away with my head held high, completely ignoring the heavy, judgmental stares of the elite guests as I made my way out of the main ballroom. The heavy double doors closed behind me, instantly muffling the chaotic noise of the gala. The grand hallway was empty and blessedly quiet. I let out a slow, steady breath, feeling the raw adrenaline rushing through my veins. My arm was throbbing where my mother had clawed me, leaving deep, angry half-moon marks on my skin. I felt a sudden, desperate need to wash my hands and gather my thoughts before executing the final phase of my plan. I walked down the plush, carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy mahogany door of the women's luxury restroom. The space was supposed to be completely empty, with everyone currently watching the drama unfold in the main room. I walked toward the expansive marble sinks, reaching for the polished gold faucet when I heard it. Coming from the large handicap stall at the very end of the row was the distinct sound of a frantic, hushed conversation. I froze, immediately recognizing the desperate crying voice filtering through the thick wooden door. I cannot do it, Julian. The voice sobbed the words, tumbling out in a panicked rush. I cannot pretend everything is fine when she knows the truth. If Tessa goes public with the embezzlement, the bank will seize everything, including my house. You promised me she would never find out about the transferred funds. I held my breath, stepping silently closer to the stall. It was Chelsea, my brother Andre's wife, crying uncontrollably on the phone to the man who was supposed to be my sworn enemy. But before she could say another word, the heavy mahogany doors of the restroom banged open with a violent thud. I heard Chelsea gasp, dropping her phone. She scrambled to pick it up, flushed the toilet to cover her noise, and practically sprinted out of the restroom, keeping her head down as she pushed past whoever had just walked in. I pressed my back against the cold tile wall of my stall and lifted my feet so my heels would not be visible under the gap of the door. The sharp clicking of expensive stilettos stomped across the floor, followed by the heavy, hurried steps of my mother. I cannot believe you let her do that. Patricia, Bianca hissed, her voice shaking with absolute rage. You promised us she was under control. You promised us she would not make a scene tonight. I am trying. Bianca, my mother pleaded, sounding more desperate and subservient than I had ever heard her. The great Patricia, the arrogant first lady of the megachurch, was practically begging my ex-best friend for forgiveness. She is just acting out because she is jealous. I will talk to Calvin. We will cut her off completely if she does not publicly apologize to Julian tonight. An apology is not going to fix this. Bianca snapped loudly, slamming something hard onto the marble counter, probably her diamond-encrusted clutch. Do you have any idea what is at stake tonight, Patricia? Apex Holdings is sending their top executives to finalize a $100 million acquisition. If Tessa starts screaming about embezzlement and morality clauses, the bank will pull out and investigate everything. I will handle her. Bianca, I swear, my mother whimpered. I will tell the congregation she is having a mental breakdown. No one will believe a single word she says once I am done with her. You better handle her, Bianca snarled, her voice echoing sharply off the mirrors. Control your daughter, Patricia. Julian paid you and Calvin $100,000 7 years ago to keep Tessa quiet about our affair. He gave you that money to pay off Andre's massive debts, so his private equity firm's reputation would not be ruined before his first major funding round. We literally bought your loyalty. We bought your family. So you need to leash your pathetic daughter right now before I ruin your precious church reputation, and tell your entire congregation how much their beloved pastor charges to sell out his own child. I stood in the narrow stall, letting those vile words wash over me. The cold tile against my back grounded me as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. 7 years ago, my parents had not forced me into silence to protect my dignity or to save our family reputation in the church. They had sold me. They had traded my heartbreak and my future for a $100,000 payoff to cover my brother's careless mistakes. My mother had stood beside me while I cried over my ruined wedding, rubbing my back and telling me to pray for strength, knowing exactly what she had done. I did not cry now. I did not feel the crushing weight of betrayal that they expected me to feel. I felt completely, entirely free. I reached into my silk evening bag and pressed the stop button on my phone screen. The voice recording app saved the file instantly, safely uploading it to my secure cloud server. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the pure adrenaline sharpen my focus into a deadly weapon. I lifted my foot and kicked the stall door open. The heavy metal latch cracked loudly like a gunshot in the echoing restroom. Both Bianca and my mother spun around violently, their faces draining of all color when they saw me step out of the stall. My mother actually stumbled backward, pressing her hand over her mouth to stifle a shocked scream. Bianca froze, completely paralyzed, her eyes glued to the smartphone resting easily in my hand. I did not yell. I did not scream or cry or ask my mother how she could do something so incredibly evil to her own daughter. I simply looked at the two women who had conspired to destroy my life, and I smiled. It was a cold, detached smile that made Bianca physically shrink back against the edge of the sinks. That was a very enlightening conversation, ladies, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational. I tapped my phone screen twice, locking it before dropping it back into my clutch. A $100,000 bribe for a pastor to cover up his future son-in-law's infidelity. I imagine the church elders and the IRS will find that transaction incredibly interesting. Tessa, please, my mother gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. You do not understand. We had to save your brother. We were going to lose the house and the church. I stepped right past her, ignoring her outstretched hand completely. I walked over to the marble sink, turned on the gold faucet, and began washing my hands, taking my absolute time to work the expensive soap into a thick lather. Bianca watched me through the mirror, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. You cannot prove anything, Bianca whispered, though her voice lacked any of its usual venom. It is your word against ours. I rinsed my hands under the warm water and reached for a thick linen towel. I dried my fingers meticulously before turning to face her directly. I do not need my word, Bianca, I said, tossing the towel onto the counter. I have the bank routing numbers from the shell company Julian used to transfer the funds to my father. I have the unredacted ledgers from his private equity firm showing the missing client money. And now I have your lovely vocal confession, safely uploaded to multiple servers. My mother let out a strangled sob, clutching the edge of the sink as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her emerald gown. Bianca just stared at me, her perfectly highlighted hair suddenly looking very dull against her ashen, terrified skin. Before Bianca could try to formulate another lie, the heavy mahogany doors of the restroom burst open again. It was my brother Andre, breathless and sweating profusely through his cheap suit. You both need to get out here right now. Andre panted, looking wildly from my mother to Bianca, completely ignoring me standing by the sinks. The whole ballroom is going crazy. Julian is freaking out on the stage. Bianca pushed past my mother, her panic shifting to sudden frantic urgency. What is happening, Andre? What is wrong? Someone just arrived. Andre gasped, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The security detail cleared the entire front entrance. The chief executive officer of Apex Holdings just walked into the ballroom. I did not run. I let my mother and Bianca scramble out of the restroom behind Andre, their high heels slipping on the polished marble floor in their frantic, desperate rush to get back to the gala. They were terrified of missing the most important man in the financial world. I simply took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my silk dress, washed away any remaining tension, and walked back down the quiet hallway toward the main event. When I stepped through the heavy double oak doors, the atmosphere in the ballroom had completely shifted. The smooth jazz music had stopped entirely. The wealthy alumni, the church elders, and the elite investors were all pressed back against the walls, leaving a wide, empty path straight down the middle of the room. A team of men in dark suits with earpieces had quietly and efficiently secured the perimeter, ensuring no one made any sudden movements. Walking down that cleared path was a man who looked like he owned the building, the city, and everyone inside it. It was Marcus Donovan. He was an absolute legend in the venture capital world, a ruthless phantom who famously destroyed entire corporations before breakfast. He rarely ever appeared in public, and he absolutely never attended university homecoming galas. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that made Julian's designer suit look like a cheap rented costume. His face was carved from granite, and his dark eyes swept over the crowd with a terrifying level of bored indifference. But the most shocking part of his grand entrance was not the imposing security detail or his legendary terrifying reputation. It was the fact that this ruthless billionaire was holding a 4-year-old boy in his arms. The little boy was dressed in a miniature velvet tuxedo that perfectly matched the midnight blue of Donovan's suit. He rested his head comfortably against Donovan's broad shoulder, looking out at the massive crowd of strangers with wide, curious brown eyes. He clutched a small plush dinosaur in one hand, completely unbothered by the heavy silence filling the grand ballroom. Up on the stage, Julian was practically hyperventilating. His arrogant keynote speech was completely forgotten, abandoned midway through a sentence about generational wealth. He realized that the ultimate boss of Apex Holdings, the very company he was bragging about, was standing right in front of him. Julian scrambled down the stage steps so fast he nearly tripped over his own expensive leather shoes. He practically shoved a wealthy church donor out of his way, desperate to reach the center aisle before anyone else could make an introduction. "Mr. Donovan?" Julian gasped, bowing slightly, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute awe and pathetic desperation. "What an absolute honor, sir. I am Julian Sterling. I am the managing director of the firm you are acquiring. I cannot believe you came down here personally tonight to sign the $100 million acquisition for my firm. This is the greatest night of my life." Julian was sweating profusely, rubbing his hands together like an eager servant begging for a crumb of attention. He was so blinded by his own ambition and greed that he did not even question why the most powerful venture capitalist in the country was carrying a toddler to a formal evening gala. He just kept bowing and scraping, babbling rapidly about his portfolio and how much money he was going to make for Apex Holdings. Donovan did not even blink. He did not slow his pace. He did not offer his hand to shake. He simply continued walking down the center aisle, looking right through Julian as if the man were nothing but a smudge on the glass. Bianca, seeing her husband struggling to make an impression, immediately snapped into action. She was not going to let this billionaire slip away without securing her status as the wife of his newest partner. She grabbed a fresh, full glass of red wine from a paralyzed waiter and pushed her way past Julian, stepping directly into Donovan's path. She threw her shoulders back, jutting her chest forward, and flashed her most practiced seductive pageant smile. "Mr. Donovan?" Bianca purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and desperate ambition. "I am Bianca Sterling, Julian's wife. We are just so thrilled to welcome you to our city. We have a private premium table right up front if you and the little one would like to join us for a drink to celebrate our new partnership." She batted her eyelashes, batting them exactly the way she had done when she first started flirting with Julian behind my back 7 years ago. She was completely confident that her charm could win over anyone in the room. She thought she was the most important woman in the building. Donovan finally stopped. He looked at Bianca with a gaze so incredibly cold, it could have frozen the entire ballroom. He shifted the 4-year-old boy higher on his hip, securely holding the child with a gentleness that completely contradicted his ruthless corporate reputation. The little boy turned his head away from Bianca's cloying, heavy perfume. He looked past her heavily made-up face and scanned the silent crowd until his bright brown eyes locked directly onto mine. "Mommy," the little boy called out, his sweet, high-pitched voice cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a clear, ringing bell. Bianca froze. Her seductive smile slowly melted off her face. She looked at the boy, and then she turned her head to follow the direction of his gaze. She looked straight at me, standing calmly at the edge of the crowd. Then she looked back at the little boy, taking in his dark, curly hair, his rich brown skin, and the distinct, familiar shape of his eyes that looked exactly like mine. Donovan stepped around Bianca, completely ignoring her existence, and walked straight toward me. He stopped right in front of me, leaning down slightly so my son could reach his little arms out to me. I smiled and gently stroked my boy's cheek, kissing his forehead. The realization hit Bianca with the violent force of a speeding train. The legendary billionaire who controlled the $100 million acquisition of her husband's firm was holding my child. And he was standing beside me, not as a superior, but as a fiercely loyal protector who answered to me. Bianca's mouth dropped open in absolute horror. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking gray and sick. Her fingers went completely numb, losing all their strength. The crystal wine glass slipped from her hand, plummeting toward the floor. It hit the polished marble with a loud, violent crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, as the dark red wine splashed heavily across the toes of her expensive silk shoes, ruining them completely. She just stood there, staring at the broken glass, completely paralyzed by the impossible scene unfolding right in front of her. Marcus Donovan, the phantom billionaire, the man who held the fate of every investor in this room in the palm of his hand, did not even spare Bianca a single glance. He stepped smoothly around the growing puddle of wine, his eyes locked entirely on me. He gently set our 4-year-old son down on the floor. Leo instantly launched himself forward, his little dress shoes pattering against the carpet. He wrapped his arms tightly around my legs and buried his face in the silk fabric of my dress. Mommy, you look so pretty, Leo mumbled, his sweet, high-pitched voice carrying in the dead quiet room. I smiled down at him, brushing his soft dark curls away from his forehead. You look very handsome in your tuxedo, my brave little man, I whispered, leaning down to smooth the tiny lapels of his jacket. Marcus stepped into my personal space, bridging the final gap between us. He did not care about the hundreds of elite alumni staring at us with their mouths open. He did not care about the heavy, suffocating silence or the utterly shocked expressions of my family sitting in the front row. He reached out and wrapped his strong arm securely around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. He lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a polite greeting or a quick peck for the cameras. It was a deep, possessive kiss that claimed me completely and publicly. His hand tangled gently in my hair, grounding me, reminding me that I was no longer the frightened girl who had been banished to the shadows. I was his wife, his partner, and his equal. He kissed me in front of every single person who had ever doubted me, erased me, or treated me like I was invisible. When he finally pulled away, he kept his hand firmly anchored on my lower back. He looked down at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute adoration and a fierce protective pride. I missed you, Marcus said, his deep, gravelly voice echoing easily across the room. The entire ballroom remained completely paralyzed. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak. My mother, Patricia, looked like all the blood had been violently drained from her body. She gripped the edge of the $10,000 VIP table, her jaw completely unhinged as her eyes darted wildly between my face and the legendary billionaire holding me. My father, Calvin, sat frozen in his seat, his pastoral composure completely shattered. Andre and Chelsea were staring at me like they had just seen a ghost, completely unable to process how the sister they had treated like a financial burden and a failure for 7 long years was now standing comfortably in the arms of the most powerful man in the financial sector. Up on the brightly lit stage, Julian was visibly short-circuiting. His handsome face was twitching as his brain desperately tried to make sense of the reality playing out in front of him. The man he idolized, the billionaire whose money was supposed to secure his entire future and elevate him to the status of a god among these investors, was holding the very woman he had abandoned, humiliated, and publicly insulted just 5 minutes ago. Julian took a shaky step forward, his microphone still gripped tightly in his sweating hand. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He let out a nervous, frantic laugh that echoed terribly through the massive speakers, making several people in the front rows wince. "Mr. Donovan?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking under the intense, suffocating pressure of the moment. "I am sorry, I am just a little confused. You know this woman. You know Tessa." Julian tried to wave his free hand dismissively, desperately trying to regain control of his shattered narrative. He forced a condescending smile, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "She is just a temp worker, Mr. Donovan. She is just a bitter ex-fiancé who likes to cause drama. She has been obsessed with ruining my life for years. She does not belong here at a high-level corporate event." The temperature in this ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Marcus slowly turned his head to look up at the stage. The warmth and adoration that had just been in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal darkness that made several wealthy investors near us physically take a step back. Marcus stared at Julian with the kind of predatory absolute stillness that preceded the destruction of corporate empires. "A temp worker." Marcus repeated the words softly, but with a dangerous cutting edge that sent a visible shiver down Julian's spine. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He nodded eagerly, desperately hoping Marcus was somehow agreeing with him. "Yes, exactly, sir. She is nobody important. She is completely unstable. We can have hotel security remove her right now so we can focus on signing the acquisition papers and celebrating our new partnership." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not yell or argue. He simply raised his left hand and snapped his fingers once. From the deep shadows near the kitchen doors, Marcus' personal assistant stepped forward. He walked briskly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the stunned crowd parting out of his way. He was carrying a small silver flash drive in his hand. He bypassed Julian completely, walking straight up the stage stairs and heading directly to the master control podium where the audio-visual equipment was housed. Julian watched in absolute terror as the assistant plugged the flash drive directly into the main projector system. "I think it is time we show everyone exactly who you are," Julian Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. The massive projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. The crisp blue and silver logo of Apex Holdings illuminated the dark stage, casting a sharp metallic glow directly onto Julian's sweating face. The high-resolution image was so massive it seemed to swallow him whole. Marcus did not even look at the screen. He kept his eyes locked on me as he reached out and smoothly slid the microphone right out of Julian's trembling fingers. Julian did not offer a single ounce of resistance. His hands were shaking so violently that he probably would have dropped the heavy metal microphone anyway. He just stood there staring at Marcus and then staring down at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror consuming his features. Marcus adjusted his grip on our son, shifting Leo comfortably against his broad shoulder before bringing the microphone up to his mouth. The entire ballroom was so dead silent, you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning vents and the shallow, panicked breathing of the people in the front row. "I do not know any temp workers," Marcus said, his deep, gravelly voice rolling across the grand ballroom with absolute lethal calm. "I only know the brilliant woman standing right over there." Marcus extended his free hand, gesturing directly toward me. The bright spotlight operators immediately took the hint and swung the heavy stage lights away from Julian, focusing them entirely on me. I stood perfectly still, bathed in the bright white light, letting every single elite investor and wealthy alumni get a crystal-clear look at the woman they had just been loudly booing. "I would like to officially introduce you all to my beautiful wife, Tessa," Marcus announced, his voice echoing powerfully off the high vaulted ceilings. "She is the sole founder and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I do not call the shots around here. I just work for her." The collective gasp that erupted from the crowd sounded like a violent rushing wave crashing into the walls of the ballroom. Hundreds of successful alumni, powerful church elders, and elite venture capitalists physically recoiled in pure shock. The very same men who had been nodding along with Julian's arrogant insults just moments ago were now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. They suddenly realized that the quiet woman they had dismissed as a bitter, jealous ex-fiancé was actually the ultimate boss of the most powerful financial firm in the entire country. Up on the brightly lit stage, Julian actually staggered backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped against the polished wood floor. He completely lost his balance and crashed hard against the heavy oak podium. He gripped the wooden edges desperately, trying to keep his legs from collapsing underneath him. His mind was clearly snapping in half as he tried to process the impossible reality playing out in front of him. For 7 long years he had told everyone that I was a pathetic failure who could not handle his success. Now he was staring at the undeniable fact that the legendary $100 million acquisition that was supposed to secure his entire legacy was entirely controlled by the woman he had discarded like trash. Down in the front row, the carefully constructed facade of my family completely disintegrated. Patricia let out a strangled, horrific gasp. Her fingers went completely limp. Her custom designer clutch slipped right through her hands and hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. Expensive lipsticks and a gold compact spilled out, rolling aimlessly under the table, but she did not even blink. Her greedy, calculating mind was short-circuiting. She had sold her own daughter for a pathetic $100,000 bribe to protect Julian, completely unaware that she was throwing away a woman who would go on to build a billion-dollar empire. The regret radiating from her face was not about losing her daughter, it was about losing access to my massive wealth. Beside her, my brother Andre looked like he had been physically struck by lightning. His jaw literally hit the floor, his mouth hanging wide open in stunned silence. He had spent years treating me like an endless ATM machine, demanding money to fund his ridiculous crypto scams while treating me with absolute disrespect. He had been cheering for Julian tonight, hoping some of that acquisition money would trickle down to save him from bankruptcy. Now he realized that his only salvation rested solely in my hands, and he had spent the last 7 years burning that bridge to ashes. Near the back doors, Chelsea stood frozen. She had watched the entire scene unfold after running from the restroom, and she knew exactly what it meant. She knew that the embezzlement conversation I had overheard was the final nail in the coffin for her husband's financial stability. She clamped her hands over her mouth, sinking back into the shadows, completely unable to face the reality of their impending ruin. I did not spare any of them another glance. I kept my eyes locked on my husband and my son as I slowly began walking down the center aisle toward the stage. The heavy silk of my dress brushed softly against the carpet. The crowd immediately parted for me, completely terrified to even stand in my way. The elite investors practically pressed themselves against the walls, bowing their heads in silent, terrified respect as I passed by. As I walked, I could feel the energy in the room shifting from arrogant dismissal to absolute fear. These were people who worshipped money above all else. They worshipped power and influence, and right now I was the only person in the building who held all three. They realized that every single nasty whisper and cruel joke they had shared about me over the years was now a massive liability. I walked up the carpeted stage steps with deliberate, measured grace. I did not rush. I let them all feel the heavy, crushing weight of my presence. When I reached the center of the stage, I stood right beside Marcus. He smiled down at me, his eyes filled with fierce pride, and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. Leo giggled, reaching out to grab a strand of my hair. Julian was hyperventilating now. He pushed himself away from the podium, his face completely pale and slick with cold sweat. He looked at Marcus, and then looked at me, his eyes darting back and forth in pure, frantic panic. "Mr. Donovan?" Julian stammered, his voice barely a weak, pathetic squeak over the speakers. You know this, temp worker." Marcus did not say a single word. He just narrowed his dark eyes at Julian with a look so incredibly lethal that Julian physically flinched backward. Marcus raised his hand and gave a sharp, brief signal to his assistant standing by the control booth. I stepped forward and gently took the microphone from my husband's hand. I turned to face the massive crowd of terrified elite guests and the crumbling shell of my former fiancé. With my free hand, I reached into my evening bag and slowly pulled out a sleek black folder. I opened the folder and carefully pulled out a thick stack of audited financial documents, holding them up for Julian to see. The laser pointer from the projection booth clicked on, and a massive spreadsheet materialized on the screen behind us. The bright glare illuminated every single fraudulent transaction Julian thought he had buried deep within his corporate accounts. I looked out at the sea of terrified investors and confused alumni. You see, Julian has been very busy bragging about this $100 million acquisition tonight, I said, my voice steady and amplified perfectly through the ballroom speakers. But what he failed to mention to all of you, his loyal investors and trusting church elders, is the actual state of his firm. Julian's face drained of whatever color it had left. He lunged forward, a desperate animalistic sound escaping his throat as he tried to grab the microphone from my hand. Marcus's security detail instantly stepped up, blocking his path with their massive shoulders and forcing him back. Marcus did not even flinch, simply wrapping his arm tighter around my waist as I directed everyone's attention to the screen. What you are looking at are the real audited financial records for Sterling Capital, I explained. For the past 3 years, Julian has been running a massive deficit. He has been systematically siphoning money from your retirement accounts, your pension funds, and your charity trust to cover his tracks. He created fake shell companies and falsified return reports to make it look like your money was growing when in reality it was completely gone. I swiped my finger across the tablet Marcus' assistant handed me. The screen behind us shifted from dry spreadsheets to a rapid high-definition montage of Bianca's Instagram posts. There she was, posing on a private yacht in Monaco. There she was showing off a $200,000 diamond necklace. There she was leaning against a fleet of custom sports cars in a sprawling mansion driveway. "And where did all your hard-earned money go?" I asked, letting the question hang in the heavy, suffocating air. "It went directly to funding Bianca's luxury influencer lifestyle." Every designer handbag, every first-class ticket to Paris, every bottle of premium champagne she flaunted online was paid for by the savings you trusted him to invest. He bled your accounts dry so his new wife could play pretend on the internet. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaotic fury. Church elders who had treated Julian like a golden child for years were now shouting in outrage, demanding their money back. Wealthy alumni were pulling out their cell phones, frantically calling their lawyers and accountants, trying to salvage whatever was left of their portfolios. The noise was deafening, a collective roar of betrayal and anger from the very people Julian had manipulated. Down in the front row, Patricia buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably over her ruined social status and evaporated wealth. Andre looked like he was going to be physically sick, gripping the table edge until his knuckles turned white. Chelsea was already inching toward the exit doors, pushing past the angry crowd in a desperate attempt to escape the blast radius of her brother-in-law's destruction. I turned my attention back to Julian, who was now gripping his hair and practically hyperventilating on the stage. He looked so small, so incredibly pathetic, stripped of his arrogant suits and his stolen money. The man who had spent 7 years making me feel completely worthless was now trembling at my feet. As the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, I am officially activating the morality clause in our preliminary contract. I announced, my voice cutting through the noise of the angry crowd like a sharp blade. I am voiding the $100 million acquisition effective immediately. Apex Holdings will not be doing business with a fraud. Julian dropped to his knees right there on the stage, sobbing loudly and begging in front of everyone. "Tessa, please, you cannot do this to me," he wailed, his hands clasped together in pure desperation. "I will lose everything. I will go to prison. You have to help me, please." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, final closure. The girl who used to cry over his rejection was long gone, replaced by a woman who knew her exact worth. My son was resting safely against his father's chest, shielded from the chaos, while the man who had abandoned me faced his ultimate ruin. "You are already going to prison, Julian," I told him plainly. "Furthermore, my legal team has already forwarded your complete embezzlement records to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are freezing your accounts and seizing your properties as we speak. You are bankrupt, Julian. You have absolutely nothing left." The realization hit the room like a bomb, detonating in slow motion. But nobody reacted more violently to this news than Bianca. She had spent 7 long years plotting, scheming, and sleeping her way into what she thought was infinite wealth and high society status. She had stolen my fiancé and paraded him around like a grand prize. Now she was standing in a puddle of spilled wine, married to a broke criminal who was about to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. She looked at Julian sobbing pathetically on the stage floor with utter, absolute disgust. The survival instinct of a desperate parasite kicked in immediately. She realized her entire luxury world was collapsing, and she needed a new host to survive. She shoved her way past the screaming investors, ignoring their angry glares, and marched right up to the very edge of the stage. Her ruined silk shoes squished quietly against the carpet, but she did not care. She completely ignored her weeping husband dragging himself across the floor. Instead, she locked her predatory gaze directly on the most powerful, wealthy man in the room. She smoothed down her stained dress, pushed her chest out, and flashed a pathetic, desperate smile, trying to summon the seductive charm that had snared Julian all those years ago. "Donovan," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she fluttered her eyelashes. "You know I have always admired you." Marcus did not even blink at Bianca's pathetic display. He looked down at her with an expression of such pure, absolute disgust that she actually faltered, her fake smile twitching at the corners. He did not bless her with a single word. Instead, he simply raised his left hand, pulled a small black remote from his tuxedo pocket, and pressed one single button. The massive projector screen behind us flickered brightly. The sprawling spreadsheets of Julian's financial crimes instantly vanished. In their place, the screen was flooded with towering high-definition screenshots of direct messages. The collective gasp from the elite Black Society of Atlanta was so loud, it actually shook the crystal chandeliers above us. Plastered, 30 feet high across the stage were 6 months' worth of explicit desperate messages sent directly from Bianca's verified Instagram and private LinkedIn accounts to Marcus' personal corporate profile. The timestamps went back half a year, proving she had been hunting the anonymous billionaire long before tonight. The text was so massive that every single church elder, wealthy investor, and alumni in the very back of the ballroom could read every filthy word. She had been relentlessly begging the phantom CEO of Apex Holdings for private exclusive meetings. There were paragraphs of her offering herself in exchange for secret funding to save Julian's failing firm and sponsor her fake luxury influencer lifestyle. The messages were accompanied by heavily edited explicit photos of herself. The final message sent just 2 weeks ago read in bold, glowing letters saying, "My husband does not need to know a thing, Mr. Donovan. I can make a private arrangement very much worth your while. Just tell me what hotel room." Bianca slowly turned her head to look at the screen. The heavy artificial sweetness completely melted off her face, leaving behind a mask of pure white, panicked horror. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. She stood there frozen in her ruined, wine-soaked silk shoes, staring at her own infidelity and absolute desperation projected for the entire city to see. Julian stared at the massive screen, his eyes tracing the dates and the explicit photos of his beautiful trophy wife. His chest began to heave. The realization hit him like a physical blow. While he had been spending every waking moment stealing from his clients to buy her designer bags and sports cars to keep up their perfect power couple image, she had been actively trying to sell herself to a billionaire right behind his back. Julian completely snapped. He let out a sound that was half scream and half animalistic roar. He lunged across the stage straight at Bianca. "You filthy gold-digging parasite!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking as spittle flew from his lips. "I ruined my entire life for you. I stole millions to give you everything you wanted, and you were begging to sleep with another man." He grabbed her roughly by the arm, his fingers digging into her expensive silk dress. Bianca shrieked in terror and lashed out, slapping Julian violently across the face with her free hand. The sharp crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the microphone that had been dropped on the floor. Their perfect, pristine marriage violently imploded right there on the wooden stage. They were screaming vicious profanities at each other physically, tearing at each other's expensive clothes. Julian's tailored suit jacket tore at the seam, while Bianca shrieked as her perfectly styled hair was pulled loose. The elite Black society of Atlanta watched in absolute stunned silence as the city's most envied power couple degraded into a pathetic, violent brawl in front of hundreds of people. Marcus' security team quickly stepped in, pulling the screaming, thrashing couple apart and dragging them toward the back exit to await the authorities. The ballroom was in a state of complete chaotic uproar. People were shouting, pulling out their cell phones to record the unbelievable destruction of Julian and Bianca Sterling. But amidst the absolute chaos, I noticed a sudden frantic movement from the front row. Patricia, Calvin, and Andre had watched the entire empire collapse and realized their golden goose was headed straight to federal prison. Their survival instincts kicked into overdrive. They saw the sinking ship, but they also saw the massive, luxurious super yacht anchored right next to it. That yacht was me. My mother stood right in front of me, her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup, but she did not care. She was completely blinded by the blinding light of my billion-dollar net worth. "Oh, my beautiful daughter," Patricia wailed, her voice echoing across the stage and carrying through the ballroom. "I always knew God had blessed you with a special purpose. I always knew you were destined to lift our family up to the highest peaks of society. This is a miracle, a true miracle from heaven." She took a step closer, trying to grab my arm again, but Marcus did not budge. His solid presence kept her at bay. Patricia just smiled through her fake tears, pivoting her strategy without missing a single beat. "We need to talk about the future," Patricia continued, her voice dropping into that familiar conspiratorial tone she used when discussing money. "We must put this new wealth into the family trust immediately to protect it. Your brother needs you right now. Andres' business is ready to expand globally, and with Apex Holdings backing him, we can build a generational dynasty. This is what family does, Tessa. We share our blessings. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, concentrated disgust. My stomach turned at the sheer audacity of her words. She was standing on the very stage where Julian had just tried to destroy me, completely unbothered by the fact that she had helped him build the weapon. She saw me as nothing more than a bank account, a convenient solution to her son's endless failures and her own insatiable greed. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to. I simply lifted the microphone in my hand and looked past my frantic family, signaling Marcus' assistant, who was still standing inside the audio-visual control booth. The assistant gave a sharp nod. He pressed a button on the master console, and the massive screens behind us went completely black. The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the distant muffled crying of Bianca being dragged out of the service elevators by security. Then a sharp crackle of static echoed through the towering concert speakers surrounding the room. A voice suddenly boomed through the ballroom. It was clear, sharp, and undeniably familiar. It was Patricia's voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings for every single elite guest and church elder to hear. The audio recording from the ladies' restroom began to play in crystal clear, high-definition sound. What was I supposed to do? Patricia, the recorded voice of my mother, snapped. Julian offered me $100,000 in cash to make sure Tessa stayed out of his way. He said she was becoming a liability to his new firm, and he needed her gone without a fight. $100,000, Chelsea. Do you know how many of Andre's debts that covered? I am not going to apologize for looking out for this family. Tessa was never going to amount to anything anyway. She was just holding Julian back. Then Chelsea's recorded voice echoed through the speakers, nervous and complicit. But Mom, what if Tessa finds out you took money to help him push her out? She is still your daughter. My mother's recorded voice laughed, a cold, heartless sound that made the air in the ballroom freeze. She is a disappointment who could not even keep a man interested. Patricia's voice sneered over the speakers. She will cry about it for a few months and then she will move on. The money was real, Chelsea. Tessa is just weak. Julian is going to be a billionaire and now our family is protected. That is all that matters. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, devastating silence in its wake. The elite Black society of Atlanta stood completely paralyzed. Hundreds of wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and deeply religious church elders stared at the stage in absolute horror. The wives of the church deacons covered their mouths, their eyes wide with shock. They had just listened to their beloved pastor's wife openly admit to selling her own daughter for a cash bribe. They had heard her call me a disappointment and casually dismiss my entire existence for a pathetic payout. Patricia's face turned the color of wet ash. The fake tears of joy instantly dried up. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but her vocal cords refused to work. She looked out at the sea of horrified faces, recognizing the women she played tennis with and the men who funded their church. She saw the absolute disgust in their eyes. Her pristine, holy reputation was completely, instantly annihilated. Andre physically backed away from her. The greedy smile melted off his face, replaced by sheer panic. He realized that the money she had taken to betray me was used to cover his own failures. The entire room now knew he was a broke failure who relied on his mother's dirty bribes to survive. Patricia raised her trembling hands, trying to speak, trying to formulate some kind of desperate lie to save herself. "It is not what it sounds like," she gasped, her voice cracking. "That was taken out of context. It was a deep fake. It was manipulated." That was when my father decided to step in. Calvin realized that his entire pastoral empire was currently burning to the ground on this stage. His church, his donors, his massive salary, it was all tied to the illusion of his perfect, pious family. He could not let this continue. He puffed out his chest, his face flushed dark purple with righteous fury. He marched toward the edge of the stage, his booming baritone voice trained from decades of preaching, cutting through the murmurs of the shocked crowd. "Turn that audio off immediately!" Calvin roared, pointing a thick finger at the control booth. "This is a private family matter, and I will not have my house disrespected in this manner. The devil is trying to sow discord in our family tonight, but I will not allow it." He turned to me, his eyes flashing with desperate, angry authority. He thought he could still control me with guilt and religious fear. He thought I was still the little girl sitting in the front pew, terrified of his booming voice. "Tessa Marie," he commanded, pointing his finger directly at my face. "You will stop this foolishness right now. The Bible commands you to honor thy father and mother. You are embarrassing this family and making a mockery of our holy values. You will step down from this stage, you will forgive your mother, and you will handle this with the quiet grace I taught you." Marcus shifted his weight, his jaw clenching as he prepared to step forward and destroy the man screaming at me. But I placed my hand flat against Marcus' chest, stopping him. I did not need my husband to fight this battle. I had been waiting my entire life to fight it myself. I looked at my father, the man who preached about truth and love every Sunday while allowing his wife to mentally destroy his daughter behind closed doors. He was not a man of God. He was a man of status. I reached into the sleek black folder I was still holding in my left hand. I bypassed the remaining financial documents and pulled out a thick red legal document heavily stamped and certified by the federal government. I held the heavy red document up so my father could see the federal seal stamped across the top. The booming pastoral voice that had terrorized me for my entire life instantly died in his throat. His eyes darted from the document to my face, and for the very first time, I saw genuine fear replace his arrogant, righteous anger. "You want to talk about honoring this family?" I said, my voice echoing through the dead silent ballroom. "Let us talk about how this family actually operates." I turned my body slowly, shifting my gaze away from my crumbling father and locking my eyes directly onto my brother. Andre actually flinched, stepping backwards so fast, he bumped into Patricia's shoulder. All that big brother confidence from 2 minutes ago evaporated into thin air. He looked like a cornered rat, sweating profusely through his designer suit, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors as if he could somehow outrun the truth. "You have been telling everyone in Atlanta about your revolutionary crypto trading platform," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You have been aggressively soliciting investments from the wealthiest members of Dad's congregation, bragging about guaranteed returns and building generational wealth. You spent the last 3 years calling me a failure, mocking my temp jobs, while you paraded around in leased sports cars and custom suits playing the role of a brilliant financial genius." I opened the red folder and pulled out a thick stack of banking records, holding them up to the bright stage lights for the entire room to see. "But your platform does not exist. Andre does it. There is no proprietary algorithm tracking market trends. There is no blockchain development team working in a downtown office. The brilliant crypto empire you have been selling to everyone is nothing but a textbook Ponzi scheme built entirely on lies and stolen money." The gasp that rolled through the ballroom this time came directly from the church elders sitting at the front tables. These were the exact men Andre had been pitching his exclusive investments to all night. Several of them physically stood up from their chairs, pointing their fingers and shouting angrily at the stage. Andre threw his hands up, stammering violently, trying to deny it, but his voice cracked into a pathetic high-pitched squeak over the noise of the furious crowd. "But that is not even the worst part, is it?" I continued, raising my voice just enough to command the room again. "Because a Ponzi scheme requires massive seed money to create the illusion of early returns. You needed millions of dollars in cash to pay off your first round of investors, so they would spread the word and bring in more wealthy victims. And since you were completely broke hiding behind maxed-out credit cards, you had to find that massive amount of money somewhere else." I looked back at my father, who was now gripping the heavy wooden podium so hard his knuckles were turning stark white. "You did not just ask Dad for a small business loan." "Andre," I said, projecting every single word with absolute lethal clarity over the speakers. "You went into the church accounting system and you illegally transferred $3 million from the congregation building fund directly into your offshore accounts." You used the church money, the money these good people donated in faith, as collateral to prop up your fraudulent lifestyle. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. People were screaming, demanding arrests, and pushing toward the front of the stage. Patricia let out a horrified shriek, covering her mouth as she realized her son's crimes were going to destroy their perfect pastoral empire. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she looked at the furious congregation members she had manipulated for decades. Calvin let out a strangled gasp, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. He had known Andre was borrowing money from the accounts, but the look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face proved he had no idea the federal government was already tracking the stolen funds. My father lunged at Andre, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive jacket and shaking him violently. "You told me it was a secure bridge loan," Calvin roared, spitting in his own son's face, completely losing his holy composure. "You told me the money would be back in the church accounts before the quarterly audit. You stupid, reckless fool, you have ruined me." Andre was sobbing now, tears streaming down his face as he tried to pry his father's heavy hands off his neck. "Dad, please, I was going to put it back," he cried, begging pathetically in front of the entire elite society he had tried so hard to impress. "The crypto market crashed. The trades went bad. I just needed more time to cover the margins. Please do not let them take me to federal prison." Near the back of the stage, Chelsea had been standing frozen in the shadows, clutching her expensive designer handbag against her chest. She had married Andre 3 years ago, specifically because he sold her a fairy tale of endless generational wealth and elite black high society. She was the beautiful white sister-in-law who had spent years looking down her nose at me, treating me like the embarrassing poor relative, while she happily swiped Andre's credit cards to buy luxury shoes and host lavish country club brunches. As the brutal reality of my words finally penetrated her calculating mind, Chelsea slowly walked out of the shadows. Her face was completely drained of color, turning a sickly shade of pale, but her eyes were cold hard and utterly ruthless. She looked at the federal indictment in my hand and then looked at her husband, who was currently blubbering and weeping while his father shook him like a rag doll. The supportive, loving wife facade instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. She realized the sprawling estate, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobe. It was all completely fake. Every single luxury she enjoyed was paid for with stolen church money that the federal government was about to seize. She realized she had shackled herself to a sinking ship, and the feds were already at the door, ready to confiscate everything she owned. Chelsea dropped her expensive designer bag onto the stage floor, letting it spill open. She did not shed a single tear for the husband she had sworn to love through thick and thin. Instead, she stared at Andre with absolute burning hatred, realizing the generational wealth she had married into was nothing but a massive criminal illusion. Without a single word of comfort, she turned her back on him completely, ready to abandon the family that had just lost everything. Chelsea realized that turning her back on Andre was not going to save her from the federal agents waiting outside. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one immediately. Her cold, ruthless glare melted away in a split second, and the fake waterworks began. She let out a loud, dramatic wail, clutching her face as she forced her trademark tears to fall. "You set us up!" she screamed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "You orchestrated this entire thing just to ruin my life because you were always jealous of me." She lunged across the stage, her manicured hand raised high, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. She did not even make it halfway. Marcus-led security guard stepped out of the shadows with terrifying speed. He caught Chelsea's wrist in midair, his massive hand wrapping around her delicate arm like a steel vice. Chelsea gasped in shock, her fake tears instantly halting as she tried to yank her arm away. The guard did not move a single muscle, simply holding her suspended in her own pathetic rage, until Marcus gave a brief, subtle nod. The guard released her wrist with a sharp flick, sending Chelsea stumbling backward until her expensive heels caught on the carpet and she collapsed onto the stage floor. I looked down at her, completely unmoved by her pathetic performance. "You can drop the victim act, Chelsea," I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the ballroom. Those tears might work at the country club, but they hold absolutely no currency here. For 3 years, you have smiled in my face while treating me like the hired help. You made sure to bring up your elite pedigree at every family dinner, you asked me to clear plates at your lavish brunches, and you constantly mocked my temp jobs. You built your entire identity on looking down at me while you spent stolen church money to fund your fake aesthetic. But you were not just spending it, were you? I continued, pulling a gray, heavily redacted document from my sleek black folder. You knew Andre's crypto business was a massive fraud for months. You heard the federal whispers, and instead of warning your loving husband, you started building your own escape hatch. You took his stolen church funds and quietly siphoned over $500,000 into private offshore accounts, registered exclusively in your maiden name. You were packing your bags to leave Andre to take the fall, while you lived comfortably on a tropical island. Andre whipped his head around, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You were stealing from me!" he shrieked, his voice echoing with raw panic and betrayal. "I committed federal fraud to buy you that life, and you were siphoning the cash behind my back to leave me in the dirt." Chelsea scrambled to her feet, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "You are a pathetic, broke loser," she screamed right back at him, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. "You think I would stay with a failure like you? I deserve better than a fake millionaire who cannot even run a decent scam." They lunged at each other, screaming vicious, horrible insults, tearing their toxic marriage apart in front of the entire stunned congregation. The noise on the stage was deafening. Andre and Chelsea were shrieking at each other while Julian and Bianca continued to sob and argue in the background. Patricia was hyperventilating against the podium, completely unable to control the disaster unfolding around her. It was absolute chaos. Then my father slammed his heavy fist against the wooden podium, creating a loud, booming crack that echoed through the massive ballroom. "Enough!" Calvin roared, his chest heaving as he stared out at the terrified crowd, and then turned his furious gaze on me. "I am the head of this family and the shepherd of this flock. You will all stop this madness immediately and respect my authority." I looked at the man who had spent his entire life using religion as a weapon to crush my spirit. He was pointing a trembling, thick finger directly at my face, trying to summon the old fear that used to keep me in line. "I am a man of God," my father shouted, his voice booming with that familiar, terrifying, righteous fury. "You will not destroy this family, Tessa. As long as my church stands, we are the pillars of this community, and you are nothing but a rebellious child throwing a selfish tantrum." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but profound pity for the pathetic, desperate man standing in front of me. His holy armor was cracking, and he knew it. "About that church, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his theatrical performance with lethal precision. I opened the final section of the sleek black folder in my hands. I pulled out a thick stack of heavily stamped real estate deeds and banking records, holding them up to the light. "I think the deacons of your congregation might have a slightly different opinion about your flawless leadership and your holy pillars." I looked past my father and signaled my assistant, who was standing attentively near the front tables. The assistant gave a sharp nod and immediately began distributing thick packets of legal documents to the church deacons who were seated in the VIP section of the crowd. Calvin watched the papers being handed out, and the last remaining drops of color completely drained from his face. His booming confidence evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Patricia stopped hyperventilating for a moment, her eyes widening in fresh horror as she realized what I was about to expose. "You stood at the pulpit every single Sunday and preached about the beauty of financial sacrifice," I said, walking slowly across the stage so my voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "You pressured single mothers and hardworking families to give 10% of their income to the building fund. You took money from elderly women who were living on fixed pensions because you promised them a new youth center and a beautifully renovated sanctuary." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the hundreds of guests. But there was never going to be a youth center. Was there, Dad? Down in the crowd, the deacons were tearing open the folders. Their eyes scanned the highlighted federal documents and the official bank statements. Deacon Miller, a man who had trusted and served my father for over 30 years, suddenly let out a strangled gasp of pure devastation. You and Patricia needed more cash to fund your lavish pastoral lifestyle. I continued projecting my voice so every person in the room heard the ugly, miserable truth. The tithes were not enough for you anymore. You wanted the luxury imported cars, the private country club memberships, and the endless designer clothes that Patricia loved to flaunt. So you secretly went behind the backs of the church board, and you took out a massive commercial mortgage on the church land itself. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He gripped the edges of his wooden podium, his knuckles turning stark white as he looked out at the furious faces of his congregation. You used the house of the Lord as a personal piggy bank, I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. You forged board signatures to secure the loan, and then you spent every single penny of it on yourselves. And when the money ran out, you defaulted on the loan because you simply could not afford the massive monthly payments anymore. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The guests stared at their beloved pastor in absolute shock. The betrayal felt by the congregation was absolute and unforgiving. These were men and women who had washed cars, sold baked goods, and emptied their meager savings accounts to support what they believed was a holy mission. They had watched Calvin parade around in tailored suits, assuming God was blessing him for his righteous leadership. Now they held the undeniable proof that his blessings were nothing more than stolen mortgages and predatory bank loans. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the property this morning, I said, enjoying the sheer panic washing over his face. The bank was going to lock the doors, seize the property, and auction off the sanctuary by next month. Your entire congregation was going to show up for Sunday service and find padlocks on the doors. But Apex Holdings stepped in and bought the church debt yesterday afternoon. I walked right up to my father, stopping just inches away from his trembling frame. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. I am your landlord, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that echoed through the microphone. And you are currently 3 months behind on your rent. The ballroom remained perfectly silent for exactly 2 seconds before absolute outrage erupted from the front tables. Deacon Miller stood up so fast he knocked his chair over backward. His face was twisted in a mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. He held the legal documents up his hands, shaking with righteous fury. You stole our tithes! Deacon Miller roared, his voice echoing louder than my father's ever had. You mortgaged the house of the Lord to buy luxury cars while we struggled to pay our own bills. You took food out of our children's mouths to pay for your wives' expensive shoes. You are a thief, Calvin. You are a complete disgrace to the cloth. The other deacons stood up, joining the chorus of absolute fury. Dozens of prominent church members began shouting at the stage, throwing their napkins down in disgust. The holy, pristine reputation my father had spent 40 years building, the empire he had used to terrorize me and control our family, was completely reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. My father raised his hands, trying desperately to pacify the furious mob forming at the edge of the stage. Brothers, please, he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. It was a temporary financial bridge. We were going to pay it back. I swear on the good book, we just needed a little more time to recover the funds. My father looked out at the sea of angry faces and finally realized that his booming voice could no longer save him. The fear tactics and religious guilt trips that he had weaponized against me for my entire childhood were completely useless against hard financial evidence. He looked like a deflated balloon, a small, pathetic man hiding behind a wooden podium that no longer belonged to him. Do not you dare invoke the holy word, Deacon Miller shouted, pointing a furious, trembling finger at my father. You have defiled everything we stand for. You have lied to us and stolen from the very people who trusted you to shepherd them. You are stripped of your title effective immediately. You are no longer the pastor of this church, Calvin. You are no longer welcome in the sanctuary, and the board of deacons will be pressing full criminal charges for gross embezzlement and fraud. Calvin physically stumbled backward as if he had been struck. He gripped his chest, his entire body deflating, His entire identity, his massive untaxed salary, his untouchable community status, it was all instantly gone. He was no longer a powerful spiritual leader. He was just a broke, disgraced fraud facing a very lengthy federal prison sentence alongside his son. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing against the stage floor as she realized she was going to be completely penniless. She would lose her massive estate, her fancy cars, and her title as the First Lady of the Church. She would be cast out of the elite society she had worshipped her entire life. I stood on the stage holding my red folder, looking down at the ruins of the family that had tried to destroy me. They had dug their own graves, and I had simply handed them the shovels. "You have no authority left here, Calvin," I said, my voice cutting through his desperate screaming like a blade of solid ice. "There is no flock left for you to shepherd. There is no family left for you to control." I looked around the massive stage, taking in the absolute and total wreckage of the people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. It was a breathtaking, beautiful disaster. To my left, Julian was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, completely broke and professionally ruined. His elite venture capital firm gone before it even opened its doors. Somewhere outside, Bianca was being hauled away by security, a social pariah whose reputation would never recover. Andre was curled up on the stage, crying like a terrified child, knowing federal fraud charges and a prison sentence were waiting for him the moment he stepped out of the building. And Chelsea was already storming down the side stairs, leaving her fake millionaire husband behind to save her own skin. And then there were my parents. The great pastor, Calvin, and his flawless First Lady, Patricia. Their holy empire was currently burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. The deacons were still shouting at them from the floor, stripping away their fake status, their community power, and the untouchable prestige they had loved more than their own daughter. My father slowly lowered his hand from the podium, his heavy chest heaving with every ragged breath. He looked at the angry mob of church members and finally realized that the booming voice he had used to terrorize our household could no longer save him. The illusion was completely broken. I reached into the very back of my black folder and pulled out one final document. It was a single sheet of paper, crisp and white, and stamped with the state seal. "There is one last piece of business we need to discuss," I said, stepping closer to my parents. Patricia looked up at me, her eyes wide with fresh terror. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, tracking dark, muddy lines down her cheeks. "When you took out that massive commercial mortgage to fund your luxury lifestyle, you did not just use the church land as collateral." I continued, holding the document up so they could both see it clearly. "The bank required a secondary asset to secure a loan of that size, especially with your terrible credit history. So you quietly signed over the deed to the family estate. The sprawling mansion with the tennis courts and the imported marble floors. The house you bought to show all your country club friends how blessed you were." My mother let out a small, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Calvin staggered backward, physically bumping into the podium as the realization hit him. "And since Apex Holdings bought all of your defaulted debt yesterday," I said, dropping my voice so it was deadly quiet, but perfectly audible over the sound system, "that means I do not just own the church. I own the mansion too." Patricia fell to her knees right there on the stage. The proud, arrogant woman who had always looked down at me as if I was a stain on her perfect life was now sobbing on the floor, ruining her expensive designer gown. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my dress. "Tessa, please!" she wailed, her voice echoing through the ballroom in a pathetic shriek. "You cannot do this to us. Where will we go? We have no money, we have nothing left. You are my daughter, my flesh and blood. Please have mercy on us, Tessa. Please do not throw us out into the street." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. I remembered the audio recording from the bathroom where she laughed about selling me out to Julian. I remembered her calling me weak and pathetic. I remembered a lifetime of being treated like an unwanted burden while she showered Andre with stolen wealth. I stepped back so her grasping hands caught nothing but empty air. "You have 48 hours to vacate my property. I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter, and you will pack your bags. If you are still inside that house by Monday morning, my security team will physically remove you and throw your belongings onto the front lawn. Patricia sobbed louder, burying her face in her hands, rocking back and forth on the stage floor. Calvin just stood there completely paralyzed, staring into the abyss of his own making. Tessa, my mother choked out through her hysterical tears. Why are you doing this to your own family? I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my soul. The scared little girl who used to cry in her bedroom begging for her mother's love was finally at peace. You sold my entire future for $100,000, I said, delivering the final devastating blow. I bought my peace of mind for $100 million. We are done. I turned my back on them and handed the folder to Marcus. He wrapped his strong arm securely around my waist, and without looking back a single time we walked off the stage, leaving the ruins of the Anderson family behind us forever. The long walk down the center aisle of the ballroom felt like a victory lap. The hundreds of elite guests parted for us, their faces a mixture of absolute shock and undeniable respect. Nobody dared to speak to me. Nobody tried to stop us. The chaotic screaming of my ex-fiancé and my family slowly faded behind us, becoming nothing more than background noise in a life I no longer belonged to. We reached the massive, heavy oak doors at the entrance of the venue. Marcus pushed them open and we stepped out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night air. I took a deep breath, letting the clean oxygen fill my lungs. It felt as if I was breathing for the very first time in my 32 years of existence. The stifling, suffocating weight of the Sterling and Anderson dynasties had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Waiting for us at the curb was our black Maybach, its engine humming quietly in the night. The driver quickly opened the rear door, and I slid into the luxurious dark leather interior. Seated inside, safely buckled into his car seat, was our 2-year-old son, Leo. He was fast asleep, clutching a small stuffed bear, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. My mother-in-law had brought him out to the car a few minutes earlier, just as we planned, keeping him far away from the toxic explosion inside the gala. Marcus climbed in beside me and closed the door, shutting out the distant sounds of police sirens that were now arriving at the venue. The heavy tinted windows cocooned us in our own private sanctuary. The driver smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remnants of my abusers far behind in the rearview mirror. I leaned my head against the cool leather seat and looked at my son. His innocent sleeping face was a powerful reminder of exactly why I had to orchestrate this total annihilation. I could not allow him to grow up in the shadow of a family that valued status over soul. I refused to let him be manipulated and broken the way I had been. The generational curse of narcissistic abuse and financial control ended tonight. It stopped with me. I turned my gaze to my husband. Marcus was watching me, his dark eyes filled with an ocean of pride and unwavering support. He reached across the seat and took my hand, weaving his warm fingers through mine. He did not ask if I was okay, because he already knew the answer. He had been my anchor through the darkest nights when I thought the pain of my parents' betrayal would literally tear me apart. He was the one who reminded me that I was not crazy, that I was not worthless, and that I deserved a life free from their poison. This is my real family, I thought to myself, squeezing his hand. The man sitting beside me and the little boy sleeping peacefully between us. They were the ones who loved me unconditionally. They were the ones who protected me. For so many years, I had believed my mother's lies. I had believed that because I was the scapegoat, because I did not fit into their pristine, shallow mold, I was somehow fundamentally flawed. I had spent my childhood trying to earn the love of a father who only saw me as a prop for his sermons, and a mother who only saw me as a pawn in her social climbing games. I had let Julian convince me that I was lucky to have him while he secretly plotted to steal my company and silence my voice. But sitting here in the quiet luxury of the Maybach, watching the city lights blur past the window. I finally understood the profound truth about value. True wealth is not measured by the size of a church congregation or the balance in an offshore bank account. It is not the designer clothes Patricia worshipped or the venture capital firm Julian tried to build on my back. True wealth is peace. It is the ability to close your eyes at night without a knot of anxiety twisting in your stomach. It is looking in the mirror and knowing you have protected your peace of mind, your self-respect, and your soul. I had bought my peace of mind for $100 million, but honestly, it was worth infinitely more than that. I had reclaimed my power. The brilliant analytical mind they had tried to suppress and exploit had been the very instrument of their downfall. I had taken every insult, every manipulation, and every betrayal and forged them into an unbreakable armor. The woman who walked out of that gala tonight was not the scared little girl they raised. She was the architect of her own destiny, the CEO of a tech empire, and a mother who had fiercely protected her child from a legacy of trauma. Tomorrow, the news cycles would explode. The local papers would detail the foreclosure of the megachurch, the federal investigations into Andre and my father, and the spectacular public collapse of the Sterling family. My parents would have to face the humiliation of packing their bags and vacating the mansion they had stolen to impress their friends. They would have to learn how to survive in a world where their holy facade no longer shielded their crimes. But I would not be watching the news. I would not be gloating over their misery. I would be too busy living my beautiful, authentic life. I would be waking up making pancakes for my son and sitting on the porch with the man who truly loved me. The past was officially dead and buried. The future was a blank canvas, and for the first time I held all the paint. Cutting off toxic family members is never an easy decision. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water, that we must forgive and endure because family is everything. But sometimes the people who share your blood are the exact ones you need to be protected from. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is walking away from the people who repeatedly show you they do not care about your well-being. It takes immense courage to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. I want to know if you have ever found yourself in a position where you had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace. Tell me if you have ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you the most because their presence in your life was destroying your soul. Share your story of breaking generational curses and reclaiming your power in the comments below. If this journey of ultimate payback and finding true independence resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over betrayal. Thank you for walking this path with me, and remember that you always have the power to rewrite your own ending.